Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Kimberly Blackringan. I'm the director here at the Ignite Hub. Welcome to the spring semester. This is our first Fireside Chat for spring 2025. We're excited to be here. We have a phenomenal lineup this semester. I said that last semester, and I mean it this semester. So I'm glad that everyone is here. We have a special presentation tonight. Before we get started, just a couple of announcements or some sentiments that I'd like to share. First, of course, thank you to Verizon for sponsoring this guest speaker series. We had a wonderful community meal across the hall. So thank you again for your sponsorship of programs like this to bring important stories to the community. The other remark that I'd like to make is just acknowledge that this is a really difficult time, especially for us that live here in the District of Columbia, the DMV, as we call it, Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. And I encourage all of us to find our safe spaces, spaces where you feel appreciated, loved, and taking time out. So self-care is really, really important right now. And I encourage all of us to find healthy ways for us to embrace self-care as we navigate going forward. So the Ignite Hub hopefully is one of those safe places that you can find that welcoming environment where you can learn and connect with other people. So that's what I'd like to say as of today, February 3rd, 2025. This is where we are. Without further ado, I'd love to introduce our guest that we have this evening. We have Dr. Arti Patel Varanasi. She is the president and CEO of the social enterprise Advancing Synergy, LLC. She has over 25 years combined experience in cancer research, advocacy, capacity building, public health, and project management. Dr. Varanasi is passionate about developing innovations that build stronger communities and enable all individuals to lead healthier and longer lives. Her focus has been on leveraging technology to address chronic disease and advance health equity and justice. She has extensive leadership involvement with notable organizations such as the National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship, Leadership Howard County, Non-Communicable Disease Roundtable, American Cancer Foundation, Health Resources and Services Administration's National Advisory on Nursing Education and Practice. Dr. Varanasi is also an educator as a senior lecturer in the Master's in Biotechnology program at the Johns Hopkins University and has taught health IT fundamentals at Howard Community College. She received her PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and MHP from Go Tar Heels, from Johns Hopkins University. Additionally, she is also a graduate of the National Science Foundation funded Activate program for women technology entrepreneurs. So let's welcome Dr. Varanasi. Welcome. Great, thank you.
And everybody online, is it going through?
Yes.
So, okay, perfect. So I'm gonna have this little clicker. So I'm super excited to be here this evening with all of you. And I understand one of my dear friends and colleagues is online, Faizi Halim, and she is the one who introduced me to Kimberly, Eduardo, and Anthony. So I really appreciate that introduction. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been here. And like, funny story, like our son actually participated in Montgomery Can Code, which is a coding summer camp that the Ignite Hub runs. And so I already had a connection, but I didn't know I had a connection, right? So that's what today's conversation is really about. And I'm going to be talking about curiosity as your drivers, lessons in science, advocacy, and entrepreneurship. And want to keep it informal. So, you know, I'll be talking, I'm going to share a little bit about my own career journey, right? Since these are career talks is my understanding. And I hope that you will be inspired by my story and move to, you know, I challenge each of you to, you know, even share as we're going through, like, you know, what resonated with you with this story, like, where is it taking you in your career? And just to get a sense of, I know some of you are longtime Ignite Hub groupies, I guess, if you want to call it that, but just get a sense of who's in the room and what brought you here today. And maybe those of you are online, you can put it in the chat, and then Anthony can maybe share. So would you like to just say your name and like what brought you here today, or if anything else you'd like to share? So that'll help me as we're kind of going through the evening. Excellent. Well, nice to meet you, Logan.
I just come here because I think the link come out on my workshop. So
Excellent. Well, welcome, Alicia. Hello, welcome.
Hello, I'm May.
May. It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, me too. And he introduced me to come.
Oh, you were the one who was waiting. Okay, so now I think maybe you'll be to more of them. So thank you for joining.
I have no clue already.
Okay. I love that. You're taking a chance.
Yes.
That's good.
Hi, I'm Jen. I am a big fan of Ignite Hub, and I'm always excited about the of hearing new journeys and speakers that inspire not just me, but everyone in the institution. So excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, welcome, Jan.
Yeah, hi, I'm Andy Lee. Yeah, so I did a career with federal government, and now I'm retired and have my own little consulting firm that I do on the side. I am, I guess, what you would call an Ignite Hub groupie.
Okay.
I'm very happy, right?
Love it.
Yeah, so I come here because it's, I like to hear the different topics, hear the experiences of other people, especially other entrepreneurs with their own companies.
Love it. And what's your consulting company focused on?
Program management.
Perfect. Thank you. And I guess you're both together, right?
I drag you along.
You drag her along.
Yeah, I'm Jane, and I actually enjoy. I think he started long before I did,
Yeah.
and he said, "Why don't you come?" And I came to a few, I think last year, and I think I really enjoy it because it gives you a lot of new ideas and a different way, a different perspective of looking at things, and you learn. I learned new things here too as well, so I really enjoy it.
Love it. Well, thank you all for sharing. And I don't know, did anybody else online want to?
Yeah, we have one in the chat. Sarah Samuels says, "Hi, I'm Sarah. I have like a health major at UMD. Dr. Varanasi's background interested me, and I'm excited to hear her journey."
Oh, awesome. Well, public health is one of my passions, so welcome, Sarah. So, feel free to interrupt me as we're talking. I will be sharing a lot about my story. Sometimes it gets a little emotional. And so if I get emotional, I apologize in advance, but that's, I think, part of the authenticity of the story. So today, during our time together, and I'm going to try and keep an eye on the clock, so we're not keeping you past the time that you're expected to be here, but I'm going to just share a little bit about curiosity as my driver, like why I picked that, and then talk about my own story, which is rooted in science, advocacy, and entrepreneurship. And I didn't necessarily plan any of that. It just it evolved, right? And it evolved from me following my passion and what excites me and what I'm most interested in. And then the opportunity, and then forging your own path. So I want each of you to think a little bit about your own path. And you're at different stages in your journey, but we can always reinvent ourselves, pivot, and always have something to share with others. No? All right, so sharing my story, I'm going to start off by, and it's going to be a little mix, right? Like a personal story, but also how it ties into some of the work that I've been doing over the past, 25 plus years. I kind of count my career starting in high school because that's when I started actually doing research. And we were actually talking at dinner about doing science fairs. And I started that journey in 9th grade, and you'll see a little bit of that. And it never stopped, right? And so I still remember my 9th grade biology teacher, Mrs. Eford, introducing us to the scientific method, and it really engaged me. And so since then, and my uncle, he was a scientist too, and he used to talk with me about all this science stuff. And he used to talk to me as I was an adult. So now I realize maybe he didn't have another audience, but I was a good audience, but that really got me into just, thinking like that too, right? He never watered anything down. So the first part of my story is putting NCDs, or non-communicable diseases, into perspective. And so I start off out with the why, and this, I start with the solar system because this is one of the areas that really sparked my curiosity when I was little. When I was growing up, my mom was going to school at the same time, and in the library at Ohio University, where she was studying, they had this really cool model of the solar system, and it seemed bigger than life. It probably wasn't that big now that I look back on it, but to a little kid, it was huge, and it was amazing. And I loved looking at that. I love thinking about different planets. I love thinking about like maybe one day I could travel there. So dreams initially of being an astronaut, and even before that, you were talking about birds. I thought it would be really cool to fly, so I wanted to be a bird, but that's not so realistic. But just that curiosity and the why. Next slide, please. So this is my dad, and I start off with his picture because I think this is really where a lot of maybe my curiosity and my journey started. So he grew up in India and came to the United States. He came here to study, and then he went back and got married and came back with my mom. And so they both traveled from India and landed up in the Midwest. And that was their journey. He grew up in a village in India, and his curiosity was, I apologize, he is not with us any longer. So sometimes I get emotional with this part. But his journey started, he was an engineer, and they didn't have running water in their village. So when the individuals came to put in a well, he actually ended up helping them. And that sparked his curiosity. And that encouraged him and motivated him, thank you, to come to the United States. Right, so he started his life here, and my mom in Kansas. They arrived in the middle of winter with just like a thin clothing, my mom, like in a sari. So, that was their life. We later moved to Ohio, where I was born, and that was the beginning of my formative years. And as I mentioned, my mom was very young, as you may have seen in that picture. She had just finished high school. She didn't have an opportunity to go to college before getting married. So as myself, might recognize me in that picture. Just a few years ago, and my little sister, we grew up in the computer lab, right? So I remember sitting in the computer lab as my mom was taking her computer classes and learning programming. I mean, I didn't learn programming, she was learning programming, right? But we would color on the computer paper, which some of you who may remember back in the day was like white and green lines. So that was really fun, huge pieces of paper, coloring sheets for kids, right? But this created my foundation, right? That's the atmosphere I grew up in, right? So around a lot of books. So the library actually became our playground. We would spend a lot of time in the library at the university and find things to do. I remember I actually found the kids section in the university library. Who knew they had like kids books in the library? But maybe it was for people who were learning, doing early childhood education. But those were my formative years, and that kind of created the foundation and planted seeds of opportunity, not only for myself, but for my sister, right? And so when I talk about putting NCDs into perspective, that education my mom had became really important in another way too. Here's my dad, and he loved gardening. So growing up in a rural part of India, that was one of the things that he did. Before going to school each morning, he would harvest the vegetables from their farm and then go sell them in the market and then go to school, right? And so he always loved gardening. When we moved I was born in Ohio, mentioned, then we moved to North Carolina. When we made that journey, he was actually diagnosed with heart disease. And so that was where NCDs first came into my life, and being with somebody who was not well, right? And so at that time, I think I was 12 or 13, he had a quadruple bypass surgery. That was the first one. A few years later, when I was a senior in high school, he had a second one. So he wasn't able to work anymore. So my mom having that education was really important because she became the breadwinner in our family, right? So in this picture, what you don't see is somebody who has heart disease, who also had 2 bypass surgeries, and from his first one, he got hepatitis C because they hadn't screened his blood in his blood transfusion. So he had chronic liver disease. But this is a wheat field in our backyard. It's probably about this big, but this was in our backyard, and he harvested the weed and loved doing it. But this was maybe about a year before he passed away. But, in this picture, you can't see that. So our family, we were kind of experiencing some of those challenges as we kind of move through, life, if you will. So I bring non-communicable diseases into this picture because this is one of those seeds that were planted and something I wanted to make a difference about. NCDs take the lives of about 41 million people each year. That's 74% of global deaths. And when we talk about NCDs, this includes heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and chronic respiratory disease, and also mental health. Oops. And if you think about that 41 million, that's the population that Canada reached on June 16, 2023. So it's an entire population of Canada. That's a lot of people, right? And these are the common NCDs. And then some of the modifiable risk factors include unhealthy diet, tobacco use, harmful use of alcohol, physical inactivity, and air pollution. So I became really interested, in just better understanding what was happening so that I could help people like my dad, right? So this is where the science comes into play. And where, I had dreams of going to medical school, and I'll talk more about that as we go on, because I thought that was the one path to be able to help people like my dad, right? And so with the science, it was about driving evidence-based action and innovation. So I say curiosity is my driver because that's what really propelled me into this world of science. This was an article that was written in our local newspaper. We don't have newspapers anymore, right, as much. But it was about my science fair project. And my teacher at that time, who I mentioned earlier, she said curiosity was my strong suit. And so this was in 9th grade, and I did a science fair project on cancer cure ancient medicines for a modern day problem. And what I was looking at was traditional Indian medicines or Ayurvedic medicines to see if they could help cure cancer. And my uncle, who was a scientist, kind of propelled me into this space a little bit. So I didn't come up with it all on my own, but I did the project on my own, and it was really eye-opening, right? And I got to be thinking, like, how can we find cures or treatments for different types of diseases? And in that, I really became embraced in the scientific method, which is you make an observation, you ask questions, you make a hypothesis, you conduct experiments. And I loved conducting experiments, right? Because you don't know what's going to happen. When you conduct an experiment, you're the first one doing that. And then you can draw conclusions, you report your results, and then you do it all over again. But in that process, it's a process of innovation and discovery, which I found super exciting, right? And so that led me to doing an undergraduate degree in biology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Like I said earlier, go Tar Heels. And I had desired to go to medical school because I thought that would be the next step in that path. Unfortunately, the schools didn't see it that way. So I ended up moving forward with doing pathology. I decided to enroll in a master's program in pathology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Here you see behind that picture is the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, which is the only only one of the NIH institutes that's not, in the Bethesda area here. And so I started working with them when I was in high school. And I still remember the day when the lab PI called me and offered me the position. Her name is Teddy Devereaux, and she became a longtime mentor and friend. And I loved it. They were studying lung cancer in the lab. And I was involved in projects to help better understand the molecular mechanisms, like within a cell, what happens, what changes happen that make that cell become a cancer cell. I started a master's degree in the department, then decided I want to try to apply to medical school again, and it didn't work out. So I didn't give up, but I said, okay, what can I do? And I decided to pursue a PhD. And I pursued a PhD in pathology because it was, the root of it was a study of diseases. So I wasn't studying a particular process or pathway like immunology or like cell biology, but looking at diseases overall and seeing what's causing them, right? In a way to how can we treat them? So I ended up actually doing my graduate work at the NIHS also, and ended up with a PhD in pathology, and my research was lung tumor susceptibility. And I'm going to share a little bit more about that. So at the same time, after I finished up my PhD, I became really interested in public health. And so I know Sarah was online and she said she had an interest in public health because as I was writing my dissertation, I realized all of the impacts, the environmental impacts that contributed to lung cancer developing. I was studying at a molecular level the genes that you could that could either help promote lung cancer or prevent lung cancer, but we weren't looking at the environmental components directly. So I became really interested in that and decided to apply to the National Cancer Institute's Cancer Prevention Fellowship Program, which is an awesome program. And because part of it was getting a master's in public health. So I was like, this is awesome. I want to get a master's in public health. I actually took an epidemiology course as I was finishing on my PhD and I loved it. And so, but the first time I applied to that program, I didn't get in. So again, there's like this roadblock. I'm like, what do I do? So instead of becoming discouraged, so resilience is a theme you'll hear, right? And you have to like keep going. I looked for other opportunities. I ended up coming to the NCI and starting a postdoc. And it happened that I had two advisors when I was in graduate school. I mentioned Teddy, another individual, Carl Barrett. He was coming to the NCI as the scientific director and said, well, why don't you start a postdoc at NCI and then see what happens? So I did that and I applied to the program again, second time work. So I ended up going through the program, doing my MPH at Johns Hopkins. And that my focus was on nutrition, immunity, and cancer prevention. And one of the things our lab did was develop cancer vaccines and tumor immunology, which is a super hot area now, right? So I loved all of that. I loved being in a lab and doing the research, but sometimes I felt like it was taking too long. So as I finished up my postdoctoral fellowship, I was like, what can I do? And I found myself at a health IT company, which I really had no business being there because I didn't know that much about health IT. But this was before digital health and all of that. And my goal is how can we leverage technology to address limited resources? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that story. But if you can see, there's kind of a theme that threads through. It's like always seeing what can we do that's on the kind of the cutting edge to move the field forward and to help those that may not have everything that they need to like stay healthy and to help, be healthy, them and their loved ones. And so the advocacy piece also came in when I was at NIHS and the National Cancer Institute. I was involved in I think it's on one of the next slides, but involved in helping start several postdoctoral organizations that focused on the professional development of graduate students and postdocs, right? So I wasn't just involved with the science, but the other pieces. And then the last piece of my journey or kind of training was the Activate program, which Kimberly mentioned. And this was funded by the National Science Foundation to take individuals who were mid-career, which I guess I kind of was mid-career at that point. But anyway, to move them forward in developing technology-based businesses. So this idea of entrepreneurship, taking your science foundations and starting a business. And that really resonated with me. I was like, wow, this would be kind of cool if I could start a business and do what I'm doing, but really advance the work of health and science. So that planted the seed for entrepreneurship. I like to say it was like a mini MBA, right? So going back a little bit to like my foundations, right? It was all about disrupting this. A cancer cell needs to survive, right? So the cancer cell is trying to think about like, how can I survive in this individual? Because I need to survive. The cancer cell is not good for the individual because it's taking over. It's not, doesn't have any stops on its growth, right? So the work that I did in the lab was looking at ways to disrupt this paradigm of what a cancer cell needs to survive. Okay? And so cancer treatment involves blocking that survival. And so I worked in some of these areas and essentially looking at genes that would prevent the cell from dividing, right? So tumor suppressor genes that if they're active, they suppress the tumor from growing, but if they're not active, the tumor is actually allowed to grow. And so I spent a lot of my graduate work looking at that and looking at it specifically in lung cancer cells. And so my first research question was, why do some people who have environmental exposures get lung cancer and others do not? So we're looking at a particular gene called KRAS, and these were tumors induced in mice, lung tumors that were exposed to a specific chemical, and then we were looking at the tumors. And they're different, you may or may not know, they're different types of mice strains. Some easily get lung tumors without any environmental exposure, and then others never get a tumor even if they're exposed, right? So we're looking in these mice to see what's the difference in their genes, right? And then the other we were looking at was a tumor suppressor gene called P16. And I got to use some cool technologies, right? Because this is kind of about technology too. This microscope on the left is a very unique microscope. And about 25 years ago, it was hot on the market. It was new. We were one of the, I think, the second lab in the country to have a laser capture microdissection microscope. And I got to use it for my PhD research. And what it does, it takes a cell. So a cell, you can't even hardly see a cell, or even a tumor that's on a microscopic slide, you can look at it and see the individual cells. With the laser, you can actually micro dissect out specific cells, right? So what we did, and you can maybe see here a little bit, is these are the lung tumors from the mice. And you can probably see that this is all blue and there's some dark areas here, and this is with the higher magnification. The high areas is where we had expression of this particular gene, right? And so we wanted to see if we looked at areas that had a lot of it and not so much, if there were differences in their genetic patterns, right? And so you can think about tumors are not homogeneous, they're heterogeneous. So if you are like doing, in this day and age, you've probably heard about targeted treatments. And so we're not looking at the tumor as a whole, but you're looking at sections. And so this was some of the early work in dissecting a lot of that and showing that you have different patterns in different tumors, right? So that was pretty exciting and pretty cool to learn about that. Then the other part of my research that I did, I mentioned nutrition, immunity, and cancer prevention. We were looking at infections that happen in individuals that eventually develop cervical cancer, and if they have infections with the HPV virus, and looking to see what their history of other infections were. And we found at a population in China where they had a really low rates of cervical cancer, and they had high rates of tuberculosis. And then if they had high rates of tuberculosis, they were more likely to be infected with HPV and potentially lead to more long-term HPV infection that could develop into cervical cancer, right? So these had implications at the same time that HPV vaccine was being developed at the National Cancer Institute. So these studies had implications in those studies because it helps us better understand what the immunity is of the individuals and how you may have to tailor treatments. Right? And so the last piece of the work that I did involved looking at cancer vaccines. And this picture here, you see a bunch of dots, but you can see some are at the top, like in panel A, and then in panel E, they're all at the bottom. All those dots represent the numbers of tumors in individuals' mice. And so you can see in panel E, we had a lot of mice that had 0 tumors. The diet that these mice were on was a mixture of our vaccine and celecoxib or Celebrex, which is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. And you've seen like other studies that have shown that this can help prevent colon tumors. So these were all collectively very exciting results that tie into cancer prevention and control. So I love doing that research, but I felt like it was going to take a long time to do it. At the same time, while I was doing the research, so this is a little bit, I talked about my advocacy and capacity building as far as, you know, being involved in building different organizations. So that kind of ties into my story of being a serial entrepreneur a little bit, and also looking at the STEM fields, right? So we see that STEM jobs are going to increase from like 2010 to 2020, and they're continuing to increase. And really, you know, in this area, it instilled my curiosity, right? Like, what can I do in this area and bring diverse areas together? I was part of a panel, a group of individuals from the National Cancer Institute that looked at training future scientists, right? What are some of the success stories and best practices? How can we share that and how can we replicate what works? At the same time, this is where the advocacy story comes in even stronger. My aunt, who's pictured here, was diagnosed with breast cancer for the second time. And so when she went to her physicians in North Carolina, they said, we can't do anything for you. And it was metastatic. And I was like, that's not, no. And at the time I was at the NCI and I was like, nope, we're not going to do that. Right. So I reached out to my contacts and we were able to enroll her on a clinical trial. And during that, she stayed with me almost a year. During that time, I unexpectedly became a caregiver. And that picture at the top right or left is of her at the NCI's, the clinical center at the National Institutes of Health, where she was getting treatment. She had a phenomenal treatment team, and she was initially responding to the clinical trial therapy, but eventually she didn't, and she passed right after her 61st birthday, way too young. So that instilled in me the desire to do a lot more. And what I saw in her was resilience, courage, strength, a fighting spirit, and she was an advocate. That smile you see was ever present. But she was also afraid. She felt helpless. She was tired. There were things she needed, and she was quiet, but she suffered quietly, and she needed more time, right? There was no reason. She could have been diagnosed earlier, but this is where, you know, the advocacy and access comes into play, right? And as a scientist, I felt like my time in the lab wasn't helping people like my aunt. So I kind of was like, okay, what can I do now, right? And so with these facts, I became more aware of the facts of breast cancer incidence and mortality. And what we know is that breast cancer in the United States is the second most common cause of death in Black women. Black women have a 40% higher death rate. Younger Black women seem more at risk. And Black women are more likely to be diagnosed with breast cancer before the age of 40 than white women. And here, if you look at these, that graph, the pink is incidence. So it is incidence is new cases, and which in new cases, it's lower among everybody. The highest incidence is in white women. But if you look at mortality, they don't have the highest mortality. So there's some differences happening, right? And these are disparities in cancer care, right? So what I became really interested in was how can we address the global burden of cancer? Not only cancer, but other NCDs, as I mentioned earlier. Like, what can we do to make sure that the treatments that exist today get to the people that need it the most, right? We have treatments that, and I love being in the lab and discovering new treatments, but the ones that we have today don't get to the people that need it the most. So what can we do to make sure that make sure that they get to those treatments, and also the new ones that happen get to the people that need it the most, right? And so 1 in 6 deaths globally are due to cancer. So my advocacy continued then at the national level. And this is me in 2018 testifying at the UN on non-communicable diseases and saying this was the third high-level meeting on non-communicable diseases. The fourth one is actually happening this September in 2025. And to encourage globally nations to come forward and see how we can prevent those causes, the preventable, risk factors. What can we do globally to address some of this? Oops. Next slide, please. Right? And so this ties into the Global Sustainable Development Goals, right? Which there's 17 right now, and the goal is by 2030 to address to address all of these. We're making progress on some, but it's never as much as we'd like, but to really reduce the global rates of poverty, right? And so this all ties together under this umbrella of advocacy. And here you see a few more pictures. This is last year with the National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship. And I was with a group of cancer survivors and advocating for bills that support cancer caregiving and cancer care coordination for cancer, because that was one of the things that my aunt would have benefited from. The picture on the lower left is in the middle is Dr. Harold Freeman, and another individual on the right, Linda Burhan-Stipoff, who I work with closely in the area of patient navigation. Dr. Harold Freeman is considered the father of cancer patient navigation, which has been shown it's an evidence-based approach to reducing cancer health disparities. And this is really, it was an honor to be pictured with him. This was last year at an American Cancer Society National Navigation Roundtable event where we honored him. And to be a part of this, and that's really where I focus my efforts. And so that's going to be the next part of my story, the entrepreneurship piece. So as I wrap up the advocacy kind of pillar of my story, I want each of you to think of advocacy as a journey, right? And it's a person who speaks or writes in support or defense of a person or cause. I think today, as we're all sitting here together, there are a lot of spaces where we can be advocates, advocate for ourselves and advocate for each other. And as a verb, it's to act as an advocate. And it's a continuous process. And I found myself, I never really planned to become an advocate, if you will, but I found myself in those situations again and again. And it's really become a part of my own journey. And in doing that, part of the advocacy, it ties back to getting the innovations to the people that need it the most. And as we continue to improve technologies and become more precise in our approaches to cancer, for example, and treatment, this was the precision medicine initiative that was launched during Obama's administration. And the focus was on having very targeted therapies to individuals. And so you see at the top on the right-hand side, we start off with chemotherapy, which, kills all cells that are rapidly dividing. That's why people often lose their hair when they go through chemo. We need more specific treatments. But as we get to those more specific treatments and we have them, how are those getting to everybody? Where's the equity in that? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Okay. So this brings me to the last pillar of my story, which is the entrepreneurship journey. And I've titled this From Idea to Impact and Driving Change. The inspiration for this journey came when I was watching a 2020 special, actually. And this group of young people from MIT had developed, one of the challenges that they were trying to address are babies who die in the first few days, right? Due to hypothermia. They're not able to hold their body temperature in other countries because they don't have incubators. Like in the hospitals here, we have an incubator, but they're not everywhere. And so they realized that paraffin wax, like if you heat it and you can just boil it and it doesn't get hotter than body temperature, it can actually, if it's put into like a blanket or something, and here they have these little like jackets, and the company was called Embrace. That is able to keep a baby warm. So they actually developed, this was their technology, and it seems so simple, but it was life-changing, right? And so that inspired me. I was like, wow, I want to do something more, right? So that inspired me to take the leap. And oftentimes when you think of entrepreneurship, you kind of just have to cut the thread, if you will, and take that leap. And thinking like an entrepreneur forced me to kind of change my mindset of thinking like a scientist a little bit, but I saw them as parallels, to see problems as opportunities and identify solutions that can initiate change. But then the piece that was really tough for me as a scientist was to identify customers, right? Because somebody has to buy your product. And that also, you have to create value that somebody's going to pay for. So that was a change in my mindset. And entrepreneurship is really, it's more than simply starting a business. It's a process through which individuals identify resources and opportunities. They allocate resources and create value. It involves identifying unmet needs and opportunities for change, right? And so Advancing Synergy was born out of that. We are a company that focuses on developing innovations that engage individuals and impact communities. Our first kind of, mission statement is displayed here. It was to design and deliver high impact, cost efficient technologies that provide access to information to help all people, especially those in under-resourced areas, to improve their health outcomes. And so I moved from the why, that curiosity, that seed of like, why does this happen? And that research mindset to how. How can we do this? How can we make a difference together through technology? So my first goal was, how can we achieve high quality cancer care? And what I found as I started doing the research and delving into it, the experience of my aunt resonated with the experience of many others. The care is often not patient-centered. Many patients don't receive palliative care to manage their symptoms. And this is something that I experienced with my aunt. Her palliative care that she received at the clinical center was amazing. That wasn't something that she hadn't received from any of our other physicians. She was having trouble breathing, so they made sure that they gave her oxygen at home. They actually did a fluoridesis, which is kind of fusing the lining of the lung and removing fluid so that she didn't have all this fluid buildup. They did everything to make her comfortable in that year that she stayed with me. And she was better able to manage her symptoms and side effects from her treatment. And their decisions were based on the latest scientific evidence. But sometimes we found in achieving high quality cancer care, that's not happening. So the challenge really is, how do we overcome disparities in cancer outcomes, especially when we have treatments and different modalities that can support patients? And with cancer, the challenge is that you have to make decisions as fast as possible, because the cancer cells that are growing in an individual's body don't stop, right? At the same time, individuals often feel isolated. They feel loneliness, and then there's an overload. There's so much information that you have to sort through to make a decision. And oftentimes they're not aware, or don't have access to this information. Along with this, and just, looking at disparities that we see in the US population, they often track around racial, ethnic minorities, low income individuals, individuals that may not have health coverage, certain geographic locations. So some of you may have heard of kind of Cancer Alley, which is in Louisiana, like along where Baton Rouge is and the Mississippi River, where they've had a lot of chemical plants and history of that. There's certain areas like in Baltimore City, for example, too, that have higher rates of cancer. Individuals belonging to sexual and gender minorities, immigrants, refugees or asylum seekers, individuals with disabilities, adolescents and young adults, and then also older adults. When we look at addressing cancer health disparities, we're looking, and these are any disparities, but really looking at the root causes, which can stem from structural inequalities and social injustices, and tie into the social determinants of health. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but happy to answer questions later. And the goal is, how can we address adverse health outcomes? And really looking at it by addressing some of the social determinants of health. So we came up with an idea, and this was actually in concert with my advisor from my MPH, Dr. Kathy Elzazar, who was at Mercy Medical Center. So she was at Johns Hopkins, and then she came to Mercy, and we came together, and looked at how can we leverage technology to address limited resources to improve cancer outcomes in low-income patients. And this was across the state of Maryland. And what we did was we developed a software platform that took that personal physical interaction of cancer patient navigation and virtualized it. This was before digital health and all the fancy stuff and all these iPads, and it was among low income breast cancer patients. So everybody got a Chromebook type device, right? So a mini laptop, if you will, and they were able to access the technology. And through that technology, we called it POINT, which stood for Point of Need Together, and it essentially functioned as a virtual advocate for these women. It connected them to information on common symptoms, nutrition, exercise, things to know after their treatment. And we launched this as a randomized clinical trial. So half of the women got the full software platform along with connection to a nurse navigator, social navigator, or social work navigator. And so that virtual support. When we finished the study, individuals in the study came back to us and said, you know what? Point was my friend. It was part of my medical team and it was my support system. We didn't expect them to say that. We just thought they'd say, oh, it was great to have this information and we were better connected. We could better manage our symptoms. But they said it was their friend. This was what they needed. They needed that support. So right then and there, that told me that yes, we can leverage technology to address limited resources and give resources to people virtually that they might not be able to get in person because they can't travel there. What we were able to provide was web-based, individualized support, tailored information. We limited their isolation. The design was actually informed by the breast cancer patients, right? So no, we hear a lot about user design, user-informed design, but we did that before all of that was popular, right? So we were able to, they had a voice in it. So the impact was that technology can be leveraged, can be used to leverage limited resources and extend the reach of those cancer care providers, right? So they were actually able to help more patients in a single day than if everybody had come to them in person. And it improved access to the flow of information for these low-income breast cancer patients. So, that was kind of the beginning of like looking at different ways that we can utilize technology, digital health to really drive impact. And that led to, some of these articles that were published, looking at how you can use that data to improve the fidelity to cancer treatment guidelines. Also, how we can use a technology-based intervention for helping these low-income individuals. And in the process of implementation, something that I want to emphasize is the key was being thoughtful, mindful, and purposeful, right? And that's all about really thinking about what's needed, being mindful of each of those patients and what they need, not just putting something out there that, okay, this is fine, but really asking them what they need. That image that I showed you of the platform, that did not look like that when we originally started. The different pieces of information that they wanted that were useful to the patients was different than what we as researchers thought, right? And so they kind of changed it. They even was like, well, this icon would be better than this icon. So it was really, at the end of the day, we ended up with a tool that they were 100% engaged in, which I think is a big, that was a huge accomplishment because and that's what led them to saying that was their friend. Our vision is to really work across across the cancer continuum, from prevention all the way to beyond treatment, and to engage individuals and impact communities, enable providers and the community-based teams to focus on their strengths, right? So we sometimes talk about people performing to their highest credential, right? And so with this type of technology that's really mindful about what each person is doing, it can improve like task sharing and task shifting and be there to address patients' medical and health questions, but also address their social needs. And what we found through our study was that the social needs were greatest, which tie back into those social determinants of health. So we were able to address their social determinants of health And I mean, our study wasn't long enough, but hopefully it would lead to better long-term outcomes. And really across this continuum of care, everywhere from outreach and prevention all the way through post-treatment and survivorship, including end-of-life care. And what we really did was we saw technology as an enabler, right? We developed a relevant technology that engaged individuals, was scalable, sustainable, and adaptable. Right? And so in being relevant, it met community needs. There was long-term usage. We can go from a small pilot to widespread usage. Sustainable, the community resources can actually sustain it, can adapt to different community needs, and accessible that it's available to everyone. And so we developed a framework, right? And at the center, it wasn't just all about the technologies I mentioned. It was about the human plus the technology. The role was to identify what the issue is, assess, take action, see what the impact is, and then sustain that impact. And our goal was to really educate, engage, and empower individuals to achieve optimal health by leveraging technology. Right? And so I shared this earlier that we saw that we did have an impact. I think some of these slides are duplicated. So that's my story, my entree into entrepreneurship, right? It started off with that technology and it's blossomed in other ways, but really came from a need, right? And so the opportunity really centers around understanding, addressing that need, and designing for impact. So when we think about health, it's really important to understand what goes into health. And what we focused on was this 80% of health outcomes that are driven by the physical environment, social determinants, and behavioral factors. Oftentimes, our system focuses on the 20%, which is at the bottom, in this healthcare realm, right? Which is the access and quality of services, but really focusing on these pieces and in concert looking at the whole person. And what our focus on is really how to be equitable. So we didn't take it in a one-size-fits-all approach. We really worked with each individual in our study to make sure, so when they got their tablet or their device, there was a training session to make sure they knew how to use it. We didn't just say, here you go, okay, you're on your own. But we sat down with them. We made sure that they knew how to navigate it. We made sure that they were digitally literate enough to use it. We had one individual that was in the study that was 80 years old, and she'd never used any device. She'd been a typist her whole life, but she never used a computer. So this was something new, but she loved it. We had another individual that was homeless. So having the device was so helpful because she was moving from home to home as she was going through a treatment. And being equitable means meeting people where they're at. So on this bottom picture, you see 4 different types of bikes. Each one is suited to the individual. Right? At the top, they all have equal bikes, but you can see in this case, equality does not equal equity, right? Having the equal bikes doesn't help. The only person that's probably okay is the third person down. Everybody else, the bike doesn't suit them, right? So really, when we think about technology and implementation, we think about how to be equitable. And advancing health equity is a core of what we do. And to achieve health equity, we have to eliminate the disparities that I talk about. We look at equity as both a process and an outcome. So it's a process of advancing health equity, but it's also an outcome. And together, it provides a fair and just opportunity to be as healthy as possible. It's about access and benefiting from new technologies and innovation for all ways, right? So that we think about how we adapt the technologies and innovations to meet the needs of each person. Right? And so in my story, it's rooted in how, from my little vantage point or where I sit, is how can I make a difference and also paying it forward? And I've been able to pay it forward both as an educator and as a contributor, right? So as was mentioned in my introduction, I've also had the opportunity to teach at a Master's in Biotech program at Hopkins. And on this right-hand side you see here is an article from during COVID that the students put together. They put together a journal piece, and it was contributions from all of their professors. And I had written about embracing curiosity and fueling your mind. And so again, that goes back to curiosity as my driver. As a contributor, I've been part of the National Navigation Roundtable, and one of the articles we published last year focuses on patient navigation job roles by levels of experience and workforce development. So that's another passion of mine, is around workforce development. And how can we develop the workforce so that it meets the needs of all of us, right? And meets the needs of those who are, in the workforce. Like, and what are the job roles that you can have as a patient navigator to help individuals? And so all of this is rooted in science, and it involves leveraging technology in positive ways. I encourage each of you to find out what the world needs and take action. And that's what I try and do every day, and recognize that the process of discovery is not one that's straightforward, right? So we have to be oftentimes, and as a scientist, you learn this, you have to be patient, because the first time you try your experiment, if you're lucky, it works. But then when you try and repeat it, it doesn't work. Then you do it like so many more times. So, being patient is truly an attribute of scientists. But this is the process. And to me, that process is exciting. That's really what drives me. My toolbox has evolved, right? I've gone from being a scientist that uses tools like in this picture, and this is actually a slide from when I do this presentation with younger kids, but I think it's still relevant here, right? So using like a beaker, having test tubes, wearing goggles, microscopes, that's not necessarily all in my toolbox right now, but I still love all those gadgets. But my tools now allow me to be creative, be a problem solver. I've gone from helping cells and figuring out how they stay healthy to helping communities stay happy and healthy. And one of the things I want to impart too is, how do we keep technology in balance? Technology absolutely has the ability to provide more access, to be adaptable, to better connect people, and to sustain individuals and communities and be more inclusive. But if we're not careful, it can also be exclusionary. It can create gaps, introduce disparities. It can block certain people from accessing certain things, can introduce inequalities and be inefficient. So we have to keep it in balance. And I share with you my process, which at the heart of it is curiosity. And it starts off with a shared interest, building relationships, finding a problem that needs to be solved, and understanding the needs of individuals and communities, identifying opportunities to address those problems and needs, and then seeing if the individuals, the communities are ready to embrace that. If they're not, maybe we have to wait a little bit, right? But it's a cyclical process that allows us to explore, to be open, to be available, and most importantly, be intentional, right? To really think about what we're doing and move forward with intention. As we move forward in our day-to-day work at advancing synergy, we're working towards health equity and health justice. And if you look at this picture, right, and some of you may have seen this, in the first image, you see equality. So the assumption is that everyone benefits from the same supports, which we know is not true. Equity is where everybody gets the support they need. And in the last picture, we have the picture of justice, where you remove that fence and everybody can see the game, the soccer game, without any accommodations or supports, because the root causes of the inequities were addressed and the systemic barriers have been removed. So we work towards that. The climates around us and everything may evolve and change, but that is at the root of what we do. And it's in honor of Black History Month, thinking about this quote from Dr. Martin Luther King from 1963. He said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And, in achieving justice, another one of his quotes is, "Of all forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane." And I think back to that, and I started off with the story of my dad. And a part of that story that I didn't share is when the first time when he had his surgery, and I remember it's probably like 12 or 13 years old and sitting in the operating room, and another family came, not in the operating room, they would not let us in the operating room, in the waiting room for the operating room, came in and their father's heart was 80% damaged. They came from a rural part of North Carolina, and there was no hospital around them. And I remember I was like, that's not fair. Like my dad was getting really good treatment. His heart was still healthy. He was going to have bypass surgery, but he was going to be okay. His other father was not. And that's where the seeds of understanding health equity were really planted for me. I didn't know what that meant at that time, but I feel humbled today to be able to work in the space and share this story with all of you. Oops. Go back. So one of the things too, always looking at ways to take action and steps forward. So last year, with 5 other organizations, Advancing Synergy joined, and we formed the Community Coalition for Lifelong Health and Wellness. We had our first summit last October, and our goal really is, how do we elevate voice of the community? Included in our coalition is Care for Your Health, which is a primary care organization that primarily serves elder individuals around our area. Community Engagement and Consulting Group, which works with individuals on workforce development and getting the resources they needed. Community Farm Share, which works with local farmers. Behe Rehab, which does physical therapy for older individuals and others in their homes. And then CASA. So we all work together in advancing health equity and looking how we can do that through systems change. So now I'm going to leave you with a few final thoughts and encourage you to forge your own path. What makes you curious? And think about understanding different and addressing different needs and designing for impact. So I want each of you to ask yourselves what your passion is, what are your short and long-term goals, and what are your strengths and weaknesses? And remember that you all are experts in something. You may not realize that you're an expert, but you are. Each and every one of you today is an expert. You are a problem solver. We problem solve every day. You may not think that you're problem solving, but you are. And you think critically, right? So these are all skills that can be applied to diverse career opportunities. And to chart your journey, it's important to have goals and objectives, but most importantly, it's also to look at what your interests are, right? Because there are definitely careers that can align with your interests and then meet your goals and objectives. I encourage you to build your own toolbox that's rooted in knowledge, communication, and trust, and think about how you can engage authentically and credibly in the community, providing accurate information, listen and learning, expressing empathy, displaying cultural competence and cultural humility, promoting action, showing respect for each other, collecting falsehoods. This is a challenging space often in the healthcare field, right? There's a lot of misinformation floating around. How do we do that in a way that's kind and respectful of others because they may have beliefs that they bring to the table, right? Having a commitment to each other, and as Kimberly said at the beginning, building trusted and safe spaces, right? And I think this is one of those spaces. And sometimes when we enter into these new spaces, we have to go beyond our comfort zones. And so I share this little story. So during COVID, there's our son. He is now 12. I guess he was almost 12 next week. 8 in this picture. And during COVID, one of the sports that could be played was baseball. And he has always loved playing baseball. And they needed 3 assistant coaches, or not assistant, 3 head coaches. And so the commissioner gets on a Zoom call with all of us, and nobody was volunteering. And then finally, I was like, I'll carry the bag, I'll do whatever you need. I don't, nope, we need a head coach. We need another head coach. So finally, I raised my hand, and my husband's like, oh. And not because he didn't think I could do it, but like, I don't know anything about baseball, right? I knew that our son liked baseball, but I was like, no, I'll do it. And talk about being out of my comfort zone. That was really out of my comfort zone. I was the kiddo on the playground that nobody picked to be on their kickball team or whatever. It was the last one. So imagine me helping to coach baseball. And that was out of my comfort zone. So if I can do that, you can do anything. I ended up doing that. I think it was going to be 1 season and done. Ended up doing it for 4 seasons. Not 4 seasons, 8 seasons, 4 years. So 4 years. And at the beginning, I had a little note card. I had a baseball diamond because I didn't even know where all the positions were. But I learned. And I love doing it. I love supporting our community and love supporting the kids. But remember this story. Whenever you're in a challenging situation, if Dr. Arthi can coach baseball, you can do anything. Right? And just remember that there's strength in our communities. And together we can and we will advance synergy. So our name was very thoughtful in that what are the ways that we can advance synergy together and across diverse sectors, just not in health. So I leave you with this message that the world needs you. Be curious, ask questions, share your knowledge, experience, and your stories, and use your tools and be an advocate. Be the change that you wish to see in the world. And remember that the future is built by each of you and is built by those who are curious. Follow your idea from idea to impact. Follow your curiosity, make a difference, and most of all, make sure you're having fun. And remember that your career is a journey. Embrace the moments and experiences to learn, grow, and evolve. And as we wrap up, I want each of you to think about, and this is kind of the teacher in me, right? The reflections. So think about 3 things that you learned today, 2 things that you're going to do, and 1 question that you have. You can either share that question with me or keep it to yourself, but want you to take something home with you today and reflect on our conversation. So my last message is, and this is actually a sign that I have in my office, and I look at this every day. If you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And this is an African proverb. So I think all of us are here together today. And I hope I'll see some of you again. And I thank you for your attention and time. And now we'll open it up for questions.
Wow. Thank you so much. That was an incredible presentation. Your storytelling. I mean, I'm speechless, but one of my, you had a question. What's
Yes.
one thing that I learned? So one of the things that I learned is how a personal experience is that driver to solve that problem. And you shared that with us in a very vulnerable way. So thank you, about how that impacted your family and how that inspired you to move forward. And I can almost guess most of us in this room and online have had some sort of experience, personal experience, that is our motivation or our drive to do whatever we're pursuing. So thank you for your inspiring words and telling your story. So the floor is open for our guests here in the hub or online. I'll come over to you.
know what to expect.
After hearing your speak, and I'm sorry, before I came, I didn't know who you are and who's the speaker today. And now, so you are a company's president and CEO.
Yes.
And my question is, before you say you are a researcher, right? Scientific, and expert in cancer research. And how about now? Are you identify yourself still a researcher?
Thank you. That's a great question. And so, so the question is, do I still identify myself as a researcher? And the answer is yes, right? So I'm not in a lab doing research, but we still do research, but it's more public health research, right? So I'm a researcher, an entrepreneur, but it's under the umbrella of my company where we do the research. So right now, we're involved in several different research studies, but really looking at what are some of the root causes related to differences in outcomes or health disparities, right? So it's a different type of research. It's more public health, epidemiological research than research that I actually did in the like a wet, what I would say wet lab research. So does that, I don't know if that answers your question. I like what I'm doing now. I miss, like when I go into a lab, I get like, I geek out, right? I'm like, oh, this is so cool. I love this. But the reason I left the lab was because that type of research for me was taking too long. The type of research that I do now, I can see immediate impacts, right? And I combine the research with working in the community and meeting individuals where they're at. So like I shared the recent paper that we published on the cancer patient navigation workforce. Those are real resources that individuals working in that field right now can use. If I was in the lab, it might take 5, 10, 15, 20 years, like to develop that cancer vaccine or to develop the next treatment, which is needed. But for me, that wasn't the right space for me to be in long term. So part of what I was able to do with the opportunities presented to me and the career path that I took, I was able to shift my positioning, right? So I still use my skills as a researcher, but I'm using them in very different ways than I did when I was in the lab. But the process, that scientific method is still the same. And I'm also able to, engage as an educator with young people and help guide them too, which I love doing as well. So great question.
Thank you. I'm also from South Carolina. I lived there for 18 years. I just moved here 2015. Yeah. I have a question about, or I'm curious about, did you try to do the research on the natural medicine? Because I have people that close to me. One person is 42 years old. She got a cervical cancer. And then they go treatment, do the chemo, do everything. But in the end is damage all the stomach and, like a stool mixed with the urine in the end. And then she just passed away last November. And then I know the other person that also close to me, she's 58. She got the same type of cancer, but she not willing because she thought that I'm already old enough. I don't want to be trouble with all the chemo and stuff. So she going to the straight diet. She only eat and drink 2 items, like because we are Muslim. She drink the Zamzam water and then the date. That's it. She not eat anything else. And then after 2 years, she's cured now. Yeah, even the doctor cannot say anything because he's stage 4. And then she just went to Mecca. Normally the people go Umrah like for 10 days. They stay there for 1 year. When they return back, her energy is double before she gets sick.
Yeah. So thank you for that question, right? And I think there's certainly merit in alternative, or other like natural medicines and things like that. And it used to be called the National Institute of Complementary Medicine, and that, but they actually started doing research on that, right? And other allied treatments, right? So we don't know exactly what happened, so I can't comment specifically, but certainly marrying, sometimes say Eastern and Western, like natural treatments with what's there and looking at it. It could be that she was given a certain diagnosis. Maybe it wasn't exactly that diagnosis and she was able to recover, but it's wonderful that she is now cancer-free and doing well. But I think this speaks to the importance of research and what your question was, like understanding, looking at individuals and maybe see what worked for one individual seeing if there's a way to test that to see if it could work more broadly, and using an evidence-based approach, right? So moving beyond maybe the one story, but using the story to gather information, and then taking an evidence-based approach, maybe looking at that approach to treatment versus something else that's standard of care, and doing it in a way that can then be replicated and potentially scaled for other people. But I think it's wonderful to hear these stories. And I think, and I saw it with my aunt, and this is my personal opinion because I've seen it multiple other people, but also your presence of mind, the mind-body relationship definitely has things, there's merit there too. And there's studies that are looking into that as well. But when you have a positive attitude, and that goes a long way. Sometimes it can't take you all the way for some people, but I've seen it from both sides. And, my aunt, I shared that she was almost a year after she was diagnosed with the metastatic breast cancer. They'd only given her a few weeks. And even when she was initially diagnosed. So, yeah. 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 So I think that's an incredible story. So, but yeah, definitely something to share and look more into. I think this gentleman had a question.
Well, I came in a little late, but after listening to you, I probably have about 20 questions. The first one has to do with, my father was in public health service. And so every time I hear something from the Surgeon General, I always think that's always very interesting. So what do you think about his recommendation about putting warning labels on alcohol for cancer? Any thoughts? And then bring that back.
Yes, I love it. So I'm a big proponent of public health and love that. And I would agree, right? I mean, there was a debate when the labels went on cigarettes, right? And I think there's enough evidence, enough data to show that alcohol can impact, cancer, the development of cancer. So I would support that actually. So that's an easy question. So I could go more into it, but it's a warning label, right? So then people can make their own decision. It's a way of being informed. Many people are going to ignore it, just like they do with the cigarettes, but not everybody. And it may give somebody pause. Maybe they'll drink a little less. I don't know, but I don't think there's no, in my opinion, again, it's just my opinion, I don't see any harm in adding the warning label because there's sufficient evidence.
For some people who do get cancer because of alcohol and those who do not, is it your suspicion that it has to do with genes?
So no, it can. It's not 100%, right? So this goes back to, and I don't remember if you were here when I was kind of talking about the whole susceptibility story, right? And so my research started out looking at lung cancer susceptibility. And the idea was it was 100%, not 100%, but just a lot of it was due to the genes, right? Like, and we used a mouse model, some of them, and their genes were mostly the same, but not exactly. And especially in these areas where the genes that could contribute to development of lung tumors, right? So yes, it could be genetic, but then also the environmental pieces, right? And this is the challenge with the environmental exposures, right? So you may be genetically predisposed. You may have a family history of getting a particular type of cancer, right? So if you're more exposed to certain carcinogens, alcohol, which is one, tobacco smoke is one, air pollution is another, potentially, physical inactivity, and all of these. So it could contribute, and it's a cumulative effect, right? In combination with genetics. But you can have people who smoke their whole life who never develop lung cancer, right? As an example. And that's what we were trying to understand. So, and you see people who may, we started smoking or, drinking alcohol, they may never develop cancer. So then they're protected in some way, and trying to understand those pieces. And then once we understand what those protections are, can that be leveraged through other therapies? And gene therapy is something that's becoming more and more out there. For example, like with cystic fibrosis, they were able to introduce gene therapy to help those individuals. So, down the road, is this something? I don't know, right? So there is definitely a genetic component, but I think, and you'll hear this term, gene environment interactions. So how do the genes interact with the environment that you're in? And all of us are in a little bit of a different environment, because environment also includes what's happening inside your own body and the environments that we're exposed to. So hopefully that answers your question. Too slow.
Too slow. Sorry. Um, Talking about the label, warning label on the food production. Uh, I noticed one thing in Chinese supermarket, maybe not only in Chinese supermarket, things I don't know is regarding or related to the government policy or something. Right now, I notice, according to my observation, 80 or more than 80% imported food production through California and to here. Almost everyone has cancer warning, and they called it California something I forgot.
That they have to put the product if they're being imported to California.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm not aware of the laws in California, so I can't say more than that. But I do notice, as products are imported from other countries, if the USDA requires that it has a certain label, then it might need to. Yeah. So yeah, the question was related to food labeling and products that are imported into the country. And so my comment was that yes, as if there are certain risks, then there's going to be a mandate to have the label. So sometimes you see the label stuck on top of the other label. Yeah. Yes.
Every part you can buy nothing, okay? But I go further. I observe, for example, one thing, the bottle is glasses. No BPA at all.
Yeah.
But the label say, oh, because this product has BPA, so will cause cancer. That's,
I know.
something like that.
I think this is a challenging space, right? Labeling consumer products. And some of it can be scary then, right? I think the labeling with alcohol is a little different because it's a Surgeon General's warning, but some of that, and then, like recently the red dye has been, I mean, they've known for years, but then recently they decided to ban it, right? So then it's up to the individual to make that decision. So some of that's then put on to the individual. And it is scary. So do you ban everything? Do you stop eating that? Do you eat it a little bit? Like, how much is it really going to impact? And we don't know. But, those are some of the studies. So again, going back to the research, I shared that I did my graduate work at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. The other program that is housed there is a national toxicology program. And as part of that program, they actually test different substances to see. And that's actually where we got some of our samples and that I could work with in my work to see how environmental exposures impact, right? But sometimes what we see in animal models does not translate to the human, right? So it's a step-by-step process. But I can understand your concerns with the labeling. I think Jen had a question.
Yeah, they're great questions. I want to start by thanking you, Dr. Varanasi, for your story, your vulnerability, and coming out and sharing all that information because it really is inspiring. My question to you as a woman entrepreneur, when did you start your LLC? How many employees you have? What support encouragement to continue as an entrepreneur, and what have been your top three like challenges?
I know.
I can tell you're a groupie. You've been here, so you're like. So let's see if I remember everything, and then we'll see. So, when I started, it was after a few years after I was in that Activate program, right? And the opportunity presented itself. I was in a different role at a company, and I just felt like I wasn't able to do what I wanted to do, right? And I mentioned that first project was with my advisor from. And for me, a lot of it happens with relationships, right? My advisor from my MPH ran into each other, and she was excited about doing something similar to what I shared. She wanted to see how technology could be used to help the cancer patients she was seeing. And so we came together. I decided, okay, I think now is the time to just take the leap, like I said, and do this full time. So that was 15 years ago. That wasn't my plan necessarily to be doing this for. I didn't know, right, what I was getting into. But it's a process, absolutely. And so we evolved, in Montgomery County, from being purely like kind of in the health tech space to more into like consulting, working on health tech projects, but working also on other public health research projects, kind of serving as what I call a mini coordinating center. So bringing teams of researchers together and then working on like big problems. Like, how do we solve this? We've had subcontracts with like the NIH, with CDC, with large organizations. And that's kind of been our model. We haven't really, I mean, we have some prime contracts, but not necessarily these huge government contracts. We more go in as a support, and that works as a women-owned small business, right? As far as our team, it's been small, usually no more than five people. But then when we work with other teams, it can be up to, like 10, 20, 50 people. It depends, right? But I have a lot of experience from when I was in the private sector and then NIH, managing everything from like a small project to large scale multi-million-dollar projects. So, able to be agile. I think that's something that's really important as an entrepreneur, is to be able to kind of be very specific in your area of expertise, but then also kind of be a jack of all trades sometimes, right? And, every year, this time of year, I'm like, why did I think starting a business was a great idea? Because I hate doing the accounting. I'm like, why did I think this was good? And then I forget about it after I do that, and then it comes to be next year, right? But I love it because what it's been enabled me to do is work in really different spaces and do different things, where each time I'm actually able to follow my curiosity. I'm able to meet different people. The thing that I think has been the biggest gift of being an entrepreneur is being able to take off for all of our sons, like field trips and places to go, and be a coach, be involved with the PTA, and do all of that, because I just asked myself, can you take the day off? Oh yeah, you can take the day off. Okay, go ahead, right? I don't have to ask anybody else. And I had that flexibility. And so I think you mentioned the challenges. The challenges are sometimes you feel very alone as an entrepreneur, but being in spaces like this, I'm involved with the mastermind group and other things, that allows me to be in spaces where I don't feel alone. I think you always are looking, there's not necessarily a steady source of income, so you got to figure that out. I'm fortunate that my husband has a full-time job, and he's fully supportive of advancing synergy and what we're doing, and believes in the mission. So that definitely helps. And I think the last challenge is you're working all the time, right? You don't really take a break. So like when our son was born, I didn't really have maternity leave, but because I had a project that was going on at the time. And so he came with me everywhere. So I think he's just kind of used to that now. But I love it. And if I can continue to do what we're doing in this space, I will definitely continue. And so maybe the next 15 years.
We have a comment in the chat from Sasha Scott saying, I'm Sasha with Montgomery County Economic Development Corporation. I help small business owners to multinational companies. The industry that I work with are real estate, health insurance, and finance. And that's the answer to the question you posed earlier in your presentation.
Okay, I think we are at time. So let's give a round of applause one more time to Dr. Varanasi.
All the questions. Well, I just want to say thank everyone. You are a wonderful audience and appreciate your attentiveness. I was trying to gauge. Nobody fell asleep on me, so I think that's a good thing, especially for an evening meeting and you had a meal before. So, but thank you again, and I wish you all the best this year. And know that we're in these shared spaces where we can come together and have these conversations and inspire each other. So, thank you all for inviting me.
And Dr. Varanasi, this is a thank you gift for volunteering your time to come here and speak to our community about your amazing career journey and the amazing work that you're doing on behalf of all of us as well. So thank you. I'm going to transition very quickly on if you're in the hub, you see a QR code on your screen, please scan that. It is our survey. If you are joining us online, there is a link in the chat. Please fill that out. The hub team, we do sit down and actually look at the responses and say, what does our community want to hear? What do they want to know? Do they want to have more information about public health or a variety of topics? So please just take a few minutes to fill that out. While you're doing that, I will do a commercial for our upcoming programs. Thank you, Dr. Varanasi. Next week, we have career coaching at the East County Educational Center. It is hybrid now. That was some feedback that we got about that. So the topic next week is transferable skills. So what you have now, how can you apply that to other career opportunities? And then our first Future of Tech Lunch and Learn is on Thursday, February 20th. We are talking about integrating AI into your brand. So we have somebody coming to talk about AI and how to help your business with a brand or anything else that you have. So she will also be coming. And then in March, believe it or not, our next Fireside Chat is about Beyond the Expected, Building Innovation one opportunity at a time. And our guest speaker is a graduate of MC. So we have alumni coming back, and she said this was the first place that she wanted to come and tell her story about how she started here at MC, and now she is working, she's cybersecurity engineer working in the federal government. So please join us back, come back and join us in March. And we have, as I said, the other programs that I mentioned. So thank you for filling out the survey. For those of you here in the hub, we have plenty of food for you to take home to share with your families. And again, thank you all for choosing to be here tonight. You have a choice on where you spend your time, and we are grateful that you chose to be here. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.